What inspired you to write on passion?
That's very hard to answer, but I will try. I think it began in the Joshua Tree Desert that I went up to as a child. My great-grandfather had one of the very few ranches in that desert place, and it was on that desert that I first made contact with what I would now describe as spirit and spirits. So I was, as a child, kind of, my religion was not named, as shamanism isn't named. That's its great advantage. And somehow that was the groundwork for it, although passion is different from that in some ways. The silence and the presence of spirit in that place, the rocks, the desert, is kind of a place of emptiness, absence. So it kind of began there, and it was always present, but I think in my 20s, it was in my 20s that my late teens that I practiced Buddhism very seriously, and that led to my illumination. By practicing Buddhism very seriously in the Tibetan monastery was conversion to Christianity. And I had a monster spiritual experience which has marked my whole life. And I became a Christian. And the shamanic bit kind of came with me underground then. Became much more overground later, but at that point it sort of came with me. The good thing about shamanism, it's there whether you recognize it or name it or not. So it's kind of like God's secret agent. And, there's no word for religion among native peoples. It's just part of the air they breathe and part of their culture and part of their everyday life. So something of that came with me. And that was the desert as well. But I became, I guess, very Greek in my Christianity. What I would call Eros-oriented. And that was very powerful for quite a long time.
Can you tell us what you mean by Eros? Because I think a lot of people don't see it quite like you do. Or
no, because the word has degenerated so much that it's just been confused with sex. Eros is a really powerful word for the ancient Greeks, and it's the one word that sums up really the whole of Greek culture, if there were to be one. Eros means light, life, and love. And I see the Eros in Christianity as the same as the Eros in Buddhism, Hinduism. I see Eros as the universal religion running from Japan to the Danube River. It didn't really get out of Eastern Europe into Western Europe. It was lost. Eros means that part of God which offers a hand to you and upholds you. And once you discover that hand has laid hands upon you, you lose your ontological anxieties. And so you become enlightened, but enlightenment carries life and love with it. So it's those three. Eros is the light, which is loving and alive. And, well, I've written a lot about that. I can't repeat that here. You may have read some of it. So, to me, that when Hindus say there is one religion called by different names, they're referring to Eros. And, of course, they're not right. That there's only one religion. There's another religion of the Daemonic, which is where passion comes in. But that religion of Eros is not only the common religion of mankind, and you can find roots of that Eros in shamanism as well, but it's the religion that sustains mankind. It's the religion that reveals the goodness of God. And it's, in a way, it's really more or less the same whether your experience of Eros is personal or impersonal. The Greek Christians personalized Eros, as did the Arabs and many others. And the shamanic experience of Eros is also personal. It's not impersonal. But the distinction between personal and impersonal in Eros is not that important, because in both, whichever way you see it, there is an experience of joining with divinity, and there is the experience of the bridge between divinity and everything else, the 10,000 things of Buddhism, and therefore...
So is ecstasy in kind of with...
For the Greeks,
yes.
the highest level of experience of the divine is ecstatic, that's right. And therefore Eros is the ecstatic experience. And for the Greeks, you can have this ecstasy not just in relationship to God. This doesn't work anyway. Well, it goes off and I can't shut it off.
Okay, well, it's okay.
Well,
yeah.
You have this experience not only in relationship to God, but nature, another person. You can have it in sex, you can have it in art. You can have it feeling very tender towards your children, seeing their frailty.
Mm-hmm.
So this ecstatic experience is an opening up experience, because God, the teaching of Eros is that God is an ecstatic being. The divine is ecstatic. It exceeds itself and goes out of itself, and therefore the creative act is an act of pure, gratuitous generosity. And it even has a childlike element of exuberance and of just, things that William Blake used to speak of when he said excess is wonderful, and eternal, and used the phrase energy is eternal delight. That is Eros. And many, many people have had different levels and kinds of experience of Eros, from mystics through poets to social workers to lovers. And Eros is very important because it's the spiritual experience of your grounding in the divine, and it's the experience which is offered to everybody most of the time. It's the kind of constant backdrop to things, in a way. And from the point of view of Eros, it's mostly we humans who put the clouds between us and the sun. The sun is always shining. The sun shines on the just and the unjust. The rain falls on those who deserve and don't deserve. There's actually no dualism in Eros, and this is quite clear in Eastern Christianity as well as it is clear in Buddhism and Hinduism and every other Oriental mystical system. One of the things that I think has changed Eros when it went west, when it came from the east and went west, is that in its sort of Greek form, it's understood to exist at all levels, not just the mystical level, and therefore there is an Eros of social togetherness. There's an Eros of personal intimacy. There's an Eros working at all levels of culture. Eros is the kind of factor of adventuring and hope that probably motivates most true learning. So Eros is not just confined to the divine, it's an experience of the divine wherein the divine overspills itself. There is a mystical experience of the soul with the divine. Many people have had that. But there is also another kind of mystical experience which maybe one wouldn't call mystical, where the divine is experienced in ordinary things. The divine is experienced in the 10,000 things, as Buddhism calls it. And the divine is not separate from the creation, but it inheres the creation. It's not merged with the creation, but neither is it separate from the creation. And it's a kind of generosity, gratuitous giving, free gift that is offered to human beings, and it mostly, maybe not 100%, but as Buddhism teaches, in large measure, it is we who deny ourselves Eros. And the main factors of our resistance to Eros include things like a darkened spiritual mind, the darkened nous, and particularly the factors in us that are, you could say, devouring, consuming, wanting to have. And that touches on both sexual lust and greed of every kind. Greed, possessiveness, and then off the back of that, the third one. And this teaching about the threefold nature of the human is the same in Eastern Orthodox Christianity as it is in Buddhism. There's absolutely no difference between them that I can see. And off the back of this sort of darkened mind, where you become prone to unreality and fantasy. And then the grasping, you could call it the grasping soul that wants to possess and have. Off the back of that, you develop hatred for rivals and sort of resentment at being blocked and all these kinds of things. So you get a sort of threefold account of human fallenness or human sin. And as I say, you get that in the Far East, and you get that in the Christian East, and there isn't that great a difference between them. It's a similar vision. So with Eros, it's kind of like, and even Wilhelm Reich said a version of this when he was talking about sexual Eros, and the fact that most people have never had an orgasm. They don't actually know what the orgasm is. And it's because they bring their devouring, not just their rational resistances and their kind of blocked control orientation into sex, but they also bring their evil impulses, which are devouring, lustful, using, exploitative. And Eros, being so generous in its basic nature, is the thing that is shared. And shamanic people understand this sharing of Eros better than any other people on the face of the earth. They're even better than Buddhists or Hindus by far. The shamanic peoples understood that what God gives you, you do not latch onto and try to keep for yourself, that you give it away to your brother, and therefore that which you hold back for yourself you have lost, but only that which you give away have you actually retained. So in Eros, loss is gain and gain is loss. And therefore there are paradoxes in Eros, there are human proclivities to be small that have to be overcome. But there is in Eros not a keen sense of a struggle between good and evil. There is a kind of relative struggle with what might be described in Buddhist terms as ignorance, or what might be described in more Christian Jewish terms as fallenness. And yet when you really look at these two in detail, you realize that in Eros, the accounts of the human stumbling block, what we put in our own path to trip ourselves up, is actually very similar. And the Christian East has always emphasized that fallenness, and I think this is fitting with Eros, is a kind of sickness in being. It's a kind of self-inflicted diminishment of our being. It's an ontological problem. And therefore they have always seen the necessity for medicines, and the church was seen as a hospital as a consequence, dishing out medicine to people. And I think that's the same as the Buddhist approach, that really in Eros there's not much place for the drama of good fighting evil. It's not what it's about. It's about ultimately it's about healing. It's about healing that in the human which clings to itself, and by clinging to itself, and it clings to itself in the way that it grasps other things, but ultimately by clinging to itself blocks out the erotic presence of the erotic gift. And all this is even in Temple Judaism as well. If you look at Temple Judaism as opposed to the king and the warrior and the prophet, then you're going to see that Temple Judaism, Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, which is very similar to the Temple Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, other kinds of mystical approaches, the Sufis in Islam, and you can trace this consciousness right back to the shamanic beginnings. They share this kind of sense of the human being as self-inflicted and ill. One of the great Eastern Orthodox Christian saints spoke about 3 states of being. He spoke about our common state of being is depletion of being, and that's sickness. And so he said we have to move from ill being to well-being. Well-being is a more healed state, therefore it's a fuller state of being. And he said, but even this fuller state of being is only a pretaste of eternal being. And so Eros ultimately offers us eternity. And I understand one of the Buddha's most famous speeches to be about the true meaning of the experiencing of this eternity that is offered to us, and that you don't go into metaphysical descriptions of it, because if you say it's this, that metaphysical description doesn't get it. If you say it's that metaphysical description doesn't get it. And people get this clinging aspect of us seizes onto these metaphysical accounts of what it will be. And this very famous speech of Buddha, which I put into one of my recent writings, says, I will only teach what is necessary to help you to have the experience. I will not give you anything else. And he said, your questions are perfectly valid. You ask whether there's a personhood who goes into eternity, whether the personhood disappears into eternity. If I say yes, you're going to misunderstand it. If I say no, you're going to misunderstand it. Any way I describe it for you, you're going to misunderstand it. Better that you experience it. And therefore, Eros, this is actually the ultimate meaning of the mystical part of it, where whatever level it operates, from, from the creator at source through to the creator experienced in the creation at many different levels. That remains true. That the experience of your link to that reality is far more important than even very perceptive metaphysical accounts of it. Sometimes the metaphysical accounts, I think, are necessary, so sometimes I prefer Hinduism to Buddhism, because I think in some circumstances the Hindus are quite right to offer people something that their mouths can crunch on. And therefore, a Hindu would give you more of an answer to the question, does anything go into Nirvana? Who goes into Nirvana? Does anything go into Nirvana? And all this kind of stuff. But that is sometimes necessary. Sometimes it's necessary to just smile and say nothing. And by doing that, to encourage people to experience these areas. So communion with Eros is an experience. It's not a speculation. It's not a teaching. Any teachings that arise out of that are merely there to point people in that direction, not to imprison them in teachings, but to point them towards the reality of that. And that seems to me to be the same from Japan to the Danube, the understanding of the importance of that, with different kinds of nuancing and different kinds of emphases. But basically, that is a tremendous, important constancy.
Now, I'm because in your thinking you contrast this Eros aspect of the divine with
not in
something
my
else.
thinking, in my experience.
Right.
I've just told you that experience is the thing.
So, can you tell us about the
Daemonic God.
Yes, yeah. I'd like you to talk about that a little bit.
The Daemonic God, and you kind of asked and we got off the subject, but probably it was okay, we had a bit of a detour through Eros, because most people's understanding of the word passion, probably they only understand passion as erotic, and that is a huge mistake. The passion that is involved in Eros, as the Greeks make very clear, is desire. And therefore it's in desire, in our desirous nature, that we put up these blocks, that we become too clinging, that we become too egoic. And we have to purify our desire in a sense, or we have to make our desire a more paradoxical, empty vessel. And that is most people's concept of passion. And of course a lot of degenerate ideas about passion, which you get in modern advertising and so on. So what is really passion? Passion is that which is kindled in us by the Daemonic God. The Daemonic God appears in shamanism alongside Eros and becomes even more central in Judaism. I think what happens in Judaism is Eros is there in the temple especially, but the Daemonic is somehow made central, and that is what is new and different about Judaism. And that is what is so hard about being a Jew. And this is why the Jews pray, God, don't notice me today. Which is a very honest and perfectly understandable prayer in light of the Daemonic. Because the Daemonic God is the God who, I don't know how to tell you this in a few words, is the God who wounds us to deepen us. And only through wounding us, in order to deepen us, restores us to the heart. The Daemonic God is the God who reveals God's heart. Now you might say, the way you were speaking about Eros, doesn't that show heart? Well, it shows love, but I would say it shows the love that is proper to the soul rather than the heart. I think the heart is a trickier proposition. It implies a much greater freedom. It implies a much more serious risk that God takes with the creation. And it implies a much more serious risk that every human being who is passionate takes upon themselves. And I think the Jews, the reason I reverence the Jews, despite the terrible things they've done and the things that they have become, particularly in modern Israel, I think is just shameful beyond words. But the reason I reverence them is because, and the reason I agree that they are the chosen people, is that although the daemonic god appears in shamanism without any shadow of a doubt, particularly in the Lakota spirit that I have most relationship with, which is Wokan Yantanka, the thunder being. He is the patron of warriors, and he is connected to wolf. All wolves honor him as their patron, so that applies to me. But the reason I particularly reverence the Jews is because God chose them to bear the wound of the daemonic in order precisely to dig out the heart from human beings. Human beings use this word heart very, very readily, and they should not. 99.9% of all people are completely disconnected from the heart. They know perfectly well what the heart is. They know perfectly well what their disconnection from it is. The heart and its energy, passion, is what we most want and what we most resist. And this, of course, is a great existential teaching as far as I'm concerned. And that there's something, this is the existential account that I find helpful to articulate the daemonic god. So I am existential without being an existentialist. But there's something in the way existence itself is organized that expresses this wounding of the human heart in order to rouse the human heart from its lethargy, its dormant state, and its tragedy. Because the real meaning of the fall, and what is different in the Jewish understanding of the fall, is that the human being is in a tragic condition because we've thrown away our heart. And we have refused to use the heart and its passion and to pay the cost, because the cost, if you do that, is simply immense. And this takes us straight into the heart of Christianity, because there is a lot of Eros in Christ's earlier mission. For much of the time, he behaves, acts, and speaks as if he were an Oriental guru, bit of Jewish prophet. Although actually, when you know the Jewish prophets well, you realize that Jesus is quite distinct from a Jewish prophet in many ways. But there is a touch of Jewish prophet, healer, shaman, all the different kinds of gifts and talents and powers that flow from Eros you can see in the early life of Jesus, in his teachings, in his miracles, in his challenges to people, and his way of awakening people. But it is later, and I think really perhaps mainly when he goes to Jerusalem, and this is why he postpones going to Jerusalem. He has to complete the Eros part of his mission before he can embrace the daemonic. But once he enters Jerusalem as the king, not as the priest, not as the prophet, the ultimate daemonic figure as the king and the king's warrior, he enters Jerusalem as the king of the Jews. And of course Isaiah says that the king of the Jews is the Messiah, who is going to be reversed and turned upside down and inside out. And if you read the 4 slave songs of Isaiah, you see there the Jewish teaching about the reversed king, the humiliated king, the broken king, the king who is broken for those who are already broken. And it is only the king who can be broken in this way, the king warrior. It cannot be a prophet and it cannot be a priest. These 2 figures have disappeared. So Christ, when he goes to Jerusalem, knows that the daemonic climax of his whole life is coming. And I remember at a very early phase when I was researching what passion means in Hebrew and what passion means in Greek, they mean pretty much the same. And eventually I found out the Celtic words for passion and so on. One of the earliest people who helped me was a Greek who described pathos as a state in which, he said, it's like this. He used a very telling metaphor. He said it's like you're in a room and there's no exit. The doors have shut and you're not leaving. So it's a fate that befalls you, and your freedom consists only in how you stand up to and face and deal with that fate. But there's no exit. So when Christ enters Jerusalem, he's in the room of no exit. And the room of no exit is similar to what Lorca meant by standing on the rim of the well in his flamenco poetry. It's a place, it's the place of life and death for the heart. It's the place of ultimate moment of truth for the heart. It's the place of ultimate drama for the heart is not with us all the time. We couldn't bear the intensity that it brings. It comes at certain moments, and it's heralded always by the same forces, the forces of the storm: lightning, thunder, rain, wind. And there are certain moments in history when these forces become active, and these are moments of change. These are moments when really dramatic change can be effected, because the daemonic is the dynamic. It's the thing that changes people. So, passion of heart is put in the room of no exit, and that's when its drama, that's when its duende, its deep song starts. And so, the heart of it, in a way, from Judaism, from shamanism to Judaism to Christ, is Christ on the cross. And Christ on the cross, for my money, is completely misunderstood in the West. I do not buy any of the doctrines of Christ on the cross in the West. I think even St. Paul is confused about the atonement. There is a deeper and a much greater meaning of the cross, which is apparent in the 4 slave songs of the Messiah in Isaiah, which is a famous text. And in this, what you are presented with is not just someone who's paying the cost for human beings' failures of heart, which of course have created the world process history as a hell on earth. But you are presented with something more great and deep, which is the human being as a hero. Christ on the cross is passion of heart going to the end of the line, taking on burdens and accepting wounds that most people would not dream of actually embracing in reality, in their worst nightmare. And yet every human being was called exactly to do this, to live the existential arena of life, to live in the worldly process as God's representative, the king warrior, and that means to be the heart in this world that represents the heart of God. And that is where we have fallen. That is what we have, that is the burden that we have put off our shoulder. And that is the weight in the deep heart that we can no longer lift. And as you know, I do not believe that Buddha or any figure of Eros ever came close to what Christ has done by lifting that ancient weight, because that is the weight of all the heart over thousands of years that we have refused. And that weight sits in your heart. It sits in my heart. And anyone who seriously reaches into the heart, who allows the suffering of their life to deepen them and to force them to go into the heart, will find that incredible weight. And such is the bravery and such is the love of passion that we do lift it. And we do carry it for a time. But the human tragedy is also the fact that even at our most heroic, we fail. And so this is where Christ becomes a universal answer to the human dilemma, and not a deus ex machina, nothing added to us that violates our problem. Because anyone who walks the way of heart and undertakes the heroism of passion will come to the point where they can no longer carry the weight. Every human being will come to the point where they fall from the heroic into the tragic. Of course, this is what tragedies portray. And this is greater than the issue of sin. Sin and all that aspect of weakness is secondary to this. And therefore, Christ on the cross is an intervention into our failure that offers us something that can go through failure, and by going through it can emerge on the other side, and therefore can keep going with passion. Christ kept going with passion. He did the exact opposite of what mankind thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago at our beginning. The beginning of our journey, we put the burden down. Christ goes to the absolute maximum in the room of no exit. This is his cross. This is the descent into hell. This is the mysterious change that happens only in hell. And the resurrection of Christ, therefore, is not a promise of eternal life. Shamanic people know the promise of eternal life. Even Jews knew it if they had fully realized it in some of the things that Moses said to them according to Christ. The resurrection actually starts the new age, or I should say the journey towards the new age. The new age is the age of the human heart restored, or what God says to Ezekiel, it's the age in which God gives us a new heart. The way he describes it, a heart of flesh rather than a heart of stone. And therefore Christ inaugurates this new meaning of the world, this new meaning of the existential arena, this new meaning of history, this new meaning of God's risk. And therefore every person who goes far enough with passion will come to the point where they need Christ. They will come to the point of breakdown, where they can do no more. And therefore there's something very sad about the life of the hero, and there are very few good novels, good stories, truthful narratives that actually depict this fact that there's a point where heroes fail. We like to see our heroes succeed in the battle that they are called to, because the heroic part of the human being is the godlike part. When in the Psalms there's a very strange passage, the Psalms of David, where God says to David, I have made you like gods, but you will die like men and fall like princes. And so our fall is the fall from nobility. And this fall of our nobility is what the cross of Christ, the descent into hell and the resurrection really addresses. Not just the collective failure which has damaged all of us, and the damage which has spread generation after generation and creeps like a plague over the whole world. So the West only sees in the cross the smallness of humans being accepted by the suffering of the God-man, the being who is God and man combined, the divine heart in the human heart. What I'm saying here is that there is another meaning, which is the meaning of our noble part coming to a point of failure and therefore turning to Christ, because the cross is an example that invites us to go where it goes and to do what it does. And I think of all the disciples, only Peter understood that clearly. Most of Christ's disciples, I think, did not understand that. This is the true meaning of Peter as the rock. And he was, of all the disciples, the most valuable, the most likely to follow the noble impulse quicker and sooner than everyone else, and yet, having done that, to then betray it, to then feel in over his head and cry out. And therefore, in a strange way, he is the most in the heart, the most in the tragedy of the heart, and therefore the one able to turn to Christ, not as a way out of that tragedy, but as a way through that tragedy. And so anyone who sincerely follows the way of heart will come to the problem of the cross. And that's why the cross is for all mankind and doesn't belong to Christians. It has nothing to do with religion or people who wants to sort of put their brand on it. It's a deed of God that addresses the human dilemma and brings us through the human dilemma. And addresses us both as sinners, yes, small, hurtful to each other in some endlessly repeated way, and yet at the same time addresses us as noble, as godlike, as heroes, but heroes whose flaw has brought them into tragedy. So, given all this, I see passion as that in the human being most akin to the heart of God, and I see passion as that in us most noble, most kingly, most warrior-like. In the prophet, passion becomes searching the depths of God's heart, searching the depths of the human heart, searching depths, searching the mystery of depths. But this is what fails. And therefore, this is what needs to be redeemed. And that's also why the way of passion is the way of redemption. And as you know, I distinguish redemption from salvation. Salvation belongs to Eros, redemption belongs to the Daemonic. Redemption means you make an investment and you redeem the investment. It comes good in the end. So the cross, the descent into hell, and the resurrection is a dramatic story and a reality of how God's gamble with the world, but also his investment in the world, is redeemed. And I've once wrote a very brief poem, and I will read this to you, and we'll stop because I don't want to say any more. Do you want the way of heart? If you want the way of heart, then you must plumb the abyss where heaven can be lost to hell, and stand in the world through passion and its sacrifice, where only by a savage cost can heaven redeem hell. I wrote that 4 years ago, but it seems to sum everything up in a way.